Oh, you're sitting comfortably. Is it dark outside? Come and join us in our waiting room. Neil calls Adventures in Science Fiction.
Greetings and welcome. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Museum of Classic Sci-Fi's very first video blog, a monthly event hopefully, and this month we'll be looking at the Blackpool exhibition, the Sontaran experiment, and one of the unloved monsters of Doctor Who, the Chimerons from Delta and the Bannerman. And hope you enjoy it. Please subscribe and see you soon. Bye.
Thought it was very appropriate to start right at the beginning of what inspired me to create the museum in the first place. And I just thought I'd show you these two publications. One is a Doctor Who poster magazine and the other is the first target book I ever got, Doctor Who and the Zarbi. So I want to start our journey by going back to the 1970s. Growing up in the early 1970s, my sort of very first 5 years of life, I have some strong memories of science fiction, and most of them are rooted in Doctor Who. I still have early memories of season 11. I think that I can just remember the giant maggots from The Green Death, but ultimately I can remember John Pertwee's Last Year, I remember Belial and the Agador, and of course my absolute favourite was the Sontarans. I can still remember Links just, but then by the time 1975 rolled around and Tom Baker's first year, stories like The Ark in Space and the Sontaran experiment, Genesis of the Daleks, Revenge of the Cybermen, these were stories that really, really left a huge impression upon me. Between 1975 and 1976, the epiphany happened. I was about 5 years old. Season 12 was airing on the TV, and my dad took me to the Doctor Who exhibition at Blackpool, where we were staying for the weekend. And I just remember this bright sunny day, I can still see it clearly, and then you went underground, and you were in a different world. And to a 5-year-old mind, seeing the things on television that you'd seen for real in front of you was mind-blowing. Absolutely. I mean, I just didn't want to leave the place. And I'll never forget going down the steps and seeing the golden Sentinel Dalek. And I can still see it now. And it was that exhibition that I never forgot and always wanted to somehow replicate. I have clear memories of seeing the Wirren, which had just been in the Ark in Space. I can remember Noah's face melting in the Wirren and seeing one there in front of me. I remember seeing Field Major Steyer. And I can remember this Triceratops in the case, and I can also see, I'm pretty certain I saw the Crinoid house miniature, which means it was probably 1976 when I went. But this was such a sort of an inspirational point that I always thought it's such an incredible thing to, even as I got older, to be able to try to take somebody from the reality of mundaneness of life and experience, even for a short time, that journey to a world of fiction and blur the two, fiction and reality. That it was something I dreamt of doing. Never thought I actually would, but I dreamt of doing it. So this leads me to the two publications that I started this little section with. My first trip, my only trip to the Blackpool exhibition, I got the poster magazine, and that is the poster magazine I got as a child. And I also got from the newsagent on the corner. I remember I went to get my first yoghurt. Yes, my very first yoghurt. I was at a corner shop, and they had a little paperback book stand, and there was Doctor Who and the Zarbi. Of course, I was of that age where I had no idea who William Hartnell was or who this Doctor was, but looking at the pictures inside, I twigged this must be the Doctor, because the TARDIS was in it, so it had to be. And it's just there was so little merchandise at the time, so you really were sort of like having to rely on paperbacks, the target books, The scant publications, I mean, this is pre-Doctor Who Weekly, so you were looking at very, very limited publications. I never got a hold of the Radio Times Anniversary Special, which had at least some photographs in. So this poster magazine was an amazing record of the stories I'd just seen on the telly. And there was one thing in particular that struck me. When I opened the page, this face just looked at me, and it was, of course, Field Major Steyer. And Steyer is my favourite Doctor Who villain, and it dates very much back to this point in my life, to being a child. He was a monster that I really, for some reason, really related to, the aesthetic and his sort of face and that. And I think this poster magazine page actually really helped reinforce that image. So I had kicked off my fascination with the Sontarans, and then I got a book that most classic fans were absolutely thrilled with, and that was the Doctor Who Monster book. And that came out, again, I got that at the newsagent in the village I lived. Because at the time there was no internet, nothing like that, it was very difficult to actually find any published material about Doctor Who. I lived in a village, so didn't have a bookshop at that point. But if it got in the newsagent, my dad would get it. So I got this book, and again, inside there was Steyer again. And again, those classic faces that I'd seen at the Blackpool exhibition and that had just been on the telly. So it was reinforcing some key characters, which are still some of my favourite in science fiction. Now, before I talk about the Sontaran experiment for a little bit, which is my favourite Doctor Who story, which will surprise quite a few people, I just want to sort of close this little bit to say that this was the beginning of my dream to build a museum. It was that 1975 exhibition, and that's why I mentioned it here in this first episode. It really was. I then went to some later in life, the Doctor Who Museum, the second one, and Llangollen, and they really helped, drive that sort of imagination further. And by that time, I had building skills, and the thought of actually maybe just creating a museum was a possibility. But it all comes back to that spark. Everybody has that. Those moments in life where something hits you so, it lights that imaginative fire, and that the Blackpool Doctor Who exhibition was absolutely it. Okay, so why the Sontaran experiment? Not everyone's fan favourite. Most people have a general fondness for it. Well, it was the monsters, I've said, but also the fact that I lived in an area where there was hills, and I could just imagine this creature appearing over the top of a hill and sort of thundering down the hillside. I could also imagine the little circular Sontaran pod just nestled in a copse of trees and coming across it one night. So it played to where I lived. It was in the imaginative sort of reality that I could sort of exist within, outside my front door. I also think that the Sontaran experiment is just such a solid little story. I saw criticism of it recently where some reviewer had said it's just like watching a lot of actors running around the countryside. Well, this is true, but that's no different to a load of actors trumping around inside a studio, is it really? The reality is everyone plays the part well. The monster is fantastic. The Galsec crew that we meet are very well clothed. They sort of look like they're in worn space uniforms. They look like flight suits. And the background, the actual location, is just fabulous because it is Dartmoor, and it is a stunning location. It's one which I visit every time I'm down south. If I'm driving down south from the north, I always try to detour through Dartmoor. I've actually spent a night in Steyer's Rocks. Yes, I'm that mad. As a few of you may have realised, I am an artist, and I do all sorts of projects, but one of the things I've never really done an awful lot of is doing duplicates or copies of things I like, with a few exceptions. I've only ever done 2 Doctor Who sculpts. One was a Davros head, and this is the other one, and it's a little Steyer sculpt, and it was one of the very first things I sculpted when I was in my early 20s. It was I think probably the first thing I ever did sculpt, and I just thought I'd show you it here because it just shows you how much the monster meant to me, that I took all this time making him, because I'm very slow. I'm a very slow sculptor. I don't know why, but there you go. Anyway, I really enjoyed trying to get the likeness of him. Looking at him now, he's a bit of an awkward pose, but I'd try to do a bit more texturing on the head, but I'm still quite pleased with him. And it's just that's the impact that this critter had on me. So now I thought I'd look at what relates to the Sontaran experiment in the museum, and if you come and visit, what you can see from this story. And basically, Doctor Who props, the older you go back in the show's history, the more difficult they are to get. And I was very, very fortunate to be able to get one of the 2 Galsec rifles that were made for the production. They were made by visual effects designer Tony Oxley, who was noted for his metalwork in the BBC effects department. And the gun itself is made of metal, it's quite heavy, and it's the hero version. In other words, it's the one that was wired up, whereas one was just a dummy. This one was wired up, so it actually fired, and it has the working trigger mechanism in it and remnants of wiring. Sadly, it's lost its little lampshade cover at the front, but it is a wonderful piece. And what's interesting is to contrast it to the Earthshot gun that's also in the museum. That was designed and created not even 10 years later, about 7 years later. But it's interesting that within that time you had Star Wars and Alien, and you had the whole design aesthetic of sci-fi weaponry and hardware had changed in literally 5 or 6 years. And so if you compare the two, it's fascinating. The Earthshot gun has got far more detail and sort of greeblies and little bits stuck on to make it look more and more sort of, more functional. And the Galsec gun by Tony Oxley is this wonderful throwback to a simpler design, the sort of more 50s ray gun aesthetic. And it's an absolutely fabulous piece, and I'm thrilled that you can come and see it in the museum because it's just so rare. The gun itself was a really lucky find. It was being advertised online by a dealer in America who had no idea what it was, except it was from the BBC. It's interesting because Tony Oxley had emigrated to America, so I don't know, I loosely think, I wonder if he'd taken that with him, and maybe it had been part of his estate after his death, but I don't know, this is pure speculation. Anyway, I saw this gun, and because it was missing that little lampshade, that actually sort of does take away from the silhouette. But I'd actually seen in the recently then published season 12 script book a design drawing for the rifle and the pistols that I've seen in the show, and there was just something about this gun. And then the closer I looked at it, it has a motorcycle piston that has been used and customized to add a bit of detail to the front of the gun. And I looked at it and I couldn't I just didn't know why something wasn't right about the gun, and I suddenly realised it's because it had lost its quite notable blue high polished chrome. But when you looked at the photos in detail, you could see in the pits of the piston there was parts of this sort of turquoise blue, and I realised then that's what it was. And it's one of those wonderful pieces that are just difficult to source, and it's just great to be able to put it on display. And if you look at Tony Oxley's work for the Ark in Space and the Sontaran Experiment, you can see all the guns are sort of metal and solid looking and quite simple in design, but it's just wonderful that these things have been literally made using solid material like that, instead of more later on that would follow you castings, resins and fiberglasses and things. It's great. It's an actual crafted metal piece. What makes this gun especially interesting as a piece is that it was reused, like several Doctor Who props were, in the series Blake 7, and this was used for Callie's debut performance as actress Jan Chappell in season 1 of the show. And it was customized a little. It had bits and pieces stuck on, and you can actually see residue on the actual gun in the museum where those bits were obviously lightly tacked on and then either pulled off afterwards or they'd fallen off. And finally, to wrap up this section about the Sontaran Experiment, some time ago, Andrew Scaletta, the wonderful artist, lovely man, he had sent me a picture which I'd bought from him, just a very small illustration from the two Doctors, and it was the Sontaran. And I was just, at that point, this was many years ago, I was just delighted to be getting a little Sontaran piece from a published book. Anyway, this huge envelope appears, and instead of this very small illustration, it turns out to be the internal book illustration from the Monsters book of Field Major Steyer. Now, it was basically Andrew, bless him, had not been able to find the drawing I'd actually bought from him, which was a very, very reasonable piece, very small piece, and instead sent me this huge book page. And what he didn't know was that it was my absolute favourite Doctor Who story. And so here it now proudly hangs in the museum. And it's quite a simple, well, I say simple painting, clearly it's not, but in terms of Andrew's output, it's quite a straightforward piece because most of the page was text. So the detail is down at the bottom of the page with a lovely picture of Steyr and the Marshal on the screen. So when you visit the museum, not only can you see the Golset rifle, you can see Andrew Scaletta's page from the Monsters book of the Field Major. And at that point, I'm now going to talk about one of Doctor Who's unloved monsters. I thought we'd look at one of Doctor Who's less loved alien, I wouldn't say foes because they're goodies really, but less loved alien races, and that is the Chimerons or Chimerons from Delta and the Bannermen. And here we are in the Museum of Classic Sci-Fi storeroom. Very rarely seen, not very big, but here we have pieces that are going to go on display soon that I am either working on or will be working on. Basically for this little blog today, here is the Chimeron suit, which is a Scorpio spacesuit from season 4, Blake 7, which was sprayed green. And I did wonder, because knowing that this was a rushed costume, that alien was a particularly rushed piece of work, I did wonder, because it's rather a nice suit. It's got some lovely details like this bit here. And I thought this looks too good to have been a chucked together alien. And of course it's because it was a rather nice costume made for Blake 7 to start with. So here is there's a few interesting pieces in here. I don't want to spoil all the surprises because there's a few more bits. So I managed to get the costume for the museum, courtesy of a very kind fan. It does need some light restoration, which I'm on with now. Not very much. But the condition was, it was donated on the grounds that I would create a brand new head for it, because the originals, to our knowledge, no longer exist. So I thought it would be quite interesting to have a quick look at the original heads. They were made by Gillian Thomas, who was the makeup designer, and they get a lot of flack. They got a lot of flack at the time, but to be honest, I think you've got to bear in mind they were probably made in a very short space of time. I would imagine probably 48 hours, something crazy like that. And they were basically an old cast from a Draconian, from the John Pertwee Frontier in Space series, and the ears were chopped off, the nodules were chopped off, and quite literally the half mask was fitted on the actors' faces, the eyes bulged up a bit, and then latex was smeared and sort of puckered up onto the actors' lower mouths, and the whole thing was sprayed green, and it was clearly done in a hurry. And when you bear in mind that they'd sprayed the costume green as well, the Scorpio flight suit just green, it clearly was done in a rush. You've got to bear that in mind when criticising something like this. You've got to think, how would you have done in that time frame? And I suspect, you'd have been chucking everything at it very quickly. So I was faced with a dilemma. Do I just try and recreate that original face mask? And looking at it on the surface, it's a fairly simple job. Bearing in mind I'd done a resculpt on the red pteroleptil, which was anything but a very simple job. I thought, okay, this is quite nice. But then I got to thinking, hang on, nobody really liked the original face mask. So what if I actually try and create something new? What if I create a new sculpt and sort of like give it the attention and time that it may have had, in a different schedule slot or something like that. So that was my intention. How could I make a better Chimeron? I say better in inverted commas, but a different Chimeron that the makeup team may have made had they got more time. So I thought, why not? It's a museum, it's got the original costume, let's try and give it a bit of TLC and do the old Chimeron some justice. Many years ago I was able to acquire the Chimeron Queen puppet that was made by Stephen Mansfield and Susan Moore for Delta and the Bannermen. This was well before the museum was ever a possibility. And it was this, of course, which I thought, aha, this has got to be the basis of the adult sculpture I'm going to start. So I thought, well, if I can just age this, because there is a big discrepancy between the adult Chimeron that was on screen and the baby. The baby puppet is a beautifully detailed piece of work. So I thought if I could just try and imagine that being aged forward in time, maybe this could be what the adult soldier would turn into. So to that end, I started looking at the puppet in the museum and started making a few sketches, and then I've begun to sculpt the new head. So as I come to close this edition of Museum of Classic Sci-Fi video blog magazine, here is the Chimeron head as it stands this evening. Beginning to get the look of Vogon from Revenge of the Cybermen around the eyebrows, but it's coming on, scaling's coming on, and I think it's going to be good. Few hours yet to do on it.